Hello folks, I hope you can see me okay. It's getting very dark, but I'm going to explain what I've written down here. Today I'm speaking about the future of food. What does the future of food look like for us as a society and really worldwide? We have such a global food system now anyway, that really when we talk about the future of food, we're talking worldwide because we grow food in one country, we ship it to another, we all import, export food, as I'm sure you know. So when we're speaking about the future of food, I want to look at, is it going to be meat-based or plant-based? I think those are the two categories that the future could fall into. Currently, I believe we're in a plant-based system. I don't think anyone would disagree with me there. The majority of the food that we eat globally and even, I think locally in every single region in the world is plant-based. So I'm based here in the UK. I believe we are mostly a plant-based diet. We are a nation that consumes probably more than average amounts of meat compared to a lot of other nations and parts of the world. However, we are still plant-based in my opinion. I think if you picture the average diet of people in the UK, I think the US too, most Western and European countries, it's still plant-based. The majority of things we're eating are vegetables, fruits, grains, legumes, things like that. So that's where we're at currently. Now, what would it take for the future of food to look like this, meat-based? So I'm just going to run you through that. First of all, it's going to take a lot more animals, okay? So this is stating the obvious, but I'll explain what that really means because I'm a farmer and I keep cows. So I keep animals and I have a good idea of what that would actually look like to vastly increase the amount of animals that we have on this planet. Because, like I said, if we're currently eating a plant-based diet, and we were to switch to a meat-based diet, that would require a vast increase in the amount of animals. So what would that actually look like? What we would need is a lot more of the agricultural land that we use worldwide to be converted to getting used for animals instead of growing crops and plants. That's what it would take. Actually, I take that back. There's another way. What we could do is mass confine a lot of animals, high production animals, say pigs and chickens would work really well in that model. Mass produce them in a confined space and produce our meat that way, our protein that way. The trouble with that is it still requires massive amounts of crop farming, massive amounts of growing plants, basically vegetables and grains and things, to pump into the confined animals that are getting mass produced. And again, so more monogastric animals like pigs and chickens, that's, by the way, their digestive system and the way they digest food, they are more suited to eating things like grains and other things, but mostly grains. Grains is the big one that we grow to feed those animals. So they're suited to that. So if we wanted to mass produce a load more meat in the form of pork and chicken, we would need also probably more grains than we already grow. And we already grow a hell of a lot of grain. So I see a problem with that. That's why here I've written must be ruminants. If we want the future to look more meat-based, it's got to be ruminants. So a ruminant animal was something like a cow, like the cows that I keep, sheep, and there's a few other examples as well. But cows and sheep are the main ruminant animals that we farm. So the reason I've said that must be ruminants is because we need to be grass-based. We need to be utilising grazing, which is keeping the animals outside on a pasture or on any sort of landscape that's growing enough forage and having them self-harvest that feed. So we don't need to mass confine them and bring grains to them. We need to let those animals go and do it. Now, that's the type of business I run, so I'm biased because I really like doing that. But I'm saying that that's what needs to be done because I think we could all agree that just pumping out more meat in the form of confinement farming isn't going to be sustainable. We do a lot of that at the minute, and don't get me wrong, it's somewhat efficient in some ways. But if the future was to look vastly different in a meat-based future, that can't fill the deficit. It's got to be the more sustainable model, which is grazing and ruminant animals. Let me switch over very, very briefly and speak about what would be needed if we are to continue with a plant-based future of food. The first thing I've written is that animals are going to be needed anyway, Now that might sound a bit strange, but let me explain. Even if we grow exclusively plants and animals, no, just plants, just crops, vegetables, grains, just crops, we're still going to need animals. Now, I'm very aware of this because I keep cattle. Animals are still a very vital part of the ecosystem, even when it comes to growing plants and vegetables and crops. So we still need, ideally, some ruminants in the system, and other, even wild animals as well. Nature needs that in the system for balance. That's how nature works. So again, if we do this, taking my bias out of the equation, we're still going to need some animals in there. And the reason that's important is because that's then a waste of energy, in my opinion. So we could be growing a plant-based food, but we've still got a lot of animals in there anyway, because that's required for the ecosystems. And then we're not harvesting those animals, we're not using those animals. So even the wild animals, there's a lot of nutrition there for human food that's going to waste. So I see that as a waste of energy, and overall a more wasteful exercise to be producing plants and animals, but just to be eating the plants. Do you see what I mean? So I think that would just be inefficient. Now, another problem we have to address if we are going to go down the plant-based future of farming and food, that rhymes, is soil stabilization. And that could equate to lower yields. I'll explain what I mean by that. Currently, our main method of producing crops, and therefore plants for human food, is quite damaging to soil. There's good methods, there's bad methods, but on the whole, the average worldwide is quite poor. And slowly, over the last few decades at least, we have been destabilizing soil and just degenerating the soil health. Now, why is that a problem? It's a problem because we're now seeing climate issues pop up. We're seeing massive amounts of erosion, we're seeing flooding, we're seeing droughts, we're seeing things like that. Trust me when I say these are all downstream effects of soil destabilization. Okay, so it's a big problem. You don't see it, but you see the consequences, 5-10 years down the line. And I believe we're seeing that now in our climate emergencies. So the reason we need to address this is because if we want to grow more crops than we currently are, we cannot be destabilizing soil in the meantime. We need to really address that urgently. And in fact, even if we don't do that, we still need to address that. That's a big problem. So the reason it could result in lower yields is because we might have to take the emphasis off of production farming, where we're trying to push for the highest yield per acre of land. So that's what most farmers are doing, which is fair enough because it's their economic model, is to try and get the most amount of production so you can make the most amount of money off of your farm. But if we need to stabilize the soil as our primary goal instead of production, it could lead to lower yields. Now, all that means is that we're going to have to maybe use more land, because if we're yielding less per acre of whatever it is, a grain, a vegetable, a fruit, we might have to use more land to produce the same amount of food, and that could bring its own problems. And do we even have enough land to do that? I'd argue we don't. So I've written here, I believe we're somewhere at 80% of utilization currently on our crop farming, on our plant farming, if you will. Well, it's crops because it's for harvest and for consumption. And what I mean is that on a global level, I believe that we are already utilizing the majority of land that we could utilize to grow crops. Do you see what I mean? So I see this here where I live in the UK, but I visited other countries, and I believe that it's the case pretty much worldwide. We don't have vast areas of land that are just sitting there unused when they could be used for farming, for growing crops. I think this is probably the predominant story of the last century, or maybe way more than that actually, several centuries, is people have settled in areas where farming is possible, and they've used every single bit of land possible because that's how we've prospered as a species. So all that to say, we're using most of the land we can already for crop growing. Now, what about the meat base? Let's switch back to there. What about the land? I believe we're sitting maybe about 50% of utilisation. So we do have room to spare, i.e. there's a lot of wild areas and wilderness and even farmland that's getting underutilised that could be utilised for meat production. So we could keep animals and we could manage that landscape with animals. A lot of these landscapes cannot be efficiently used to grow crops because they're too inaccessible, they're not productive enough, they're not efficient enough to use machinery and things like that, but they can be used to grow animals. So I believe we're maybe at 50%. That's an absolute ballpark figure, a bit of a guess. However, I just think there's a lot more scope to ramp up production of animals versus crops. The final thing is health outcomes. So the future of food is going to dictate the future of health, human health on a global scale. I believe that the health outcomes, if we move towards this meat-based future, are going to be far better, far more beneficial. And then the knock-on effects of that is far less public spending in terms of healthcare, far less wastefulness in terms of human healthcare, and hopefully more sort of longevity, more joy and more enjoyment of life, for every single human. So I think that would be really good if we move towards a meat-based one. I won't get into the weeds too much on this. I've made some other videos about meat-based diets, plant-based diets, and health effects in the past, so you can go and watch them. But let's just touch on the health outcomes about plant-based. Again, I see the big problem is we don't have the scope right now to grow a lot more plants on a sustainable level. We simply don't. We're sitting at high utilization already. And frankly, it's not looking good, is it? It's not looking good for soil stabilization. It's not even looking good for human health. If we're currently mostly eating plant-based diet, and the current state of human health, I think we could all agree, is quite poor. So call me crazy, but I see a correlation there. So I would much rather we move to a meat-based diet for the future of food, and we keep it much more sustainable in terms of the land usage and much more sustainable and optimal in terms of human health. So that hopefully sums it up. You might not be able to read that. I can't tell how dark it is. But thank you for sticking with me and listening to what I have to say. We'll see you on the next video.